Right now, somewhere on this planet, two people are pretending not to care about each other nearly as much as they actually do. Someone is checking a message, rereading it, deleting their reply, rewriting it, then deleting it again because every word suddenly feels too desperate or too distant or too dangerous. Someone is staring at a little glowing screen trying to decode emotional meaning from punctuation, response time, and one suspiciously casual haha. And beneath all of that overthinking, under the performance, under the pride, under the strategies we pretend are rational, there is the same old fear that has followed our species for longer than memory. The fear that if I reach for you, you might not reach back. Now here is the question that gets strange very fast. How old is that feeling? Not dating, not marriage licenses, not poetry, not roses, candlelight, or slow songs. The feeling itself, the ache of wanting one specific person, the irrational pull towards someone who suddenly matters more than they logically should. The beginning of attachment, the beginning of preference, the beginning of that terrifying, beautiful shift where another human being stops being just another human being and becomes the human being. Because if you go back far enough, romance was never supposed to be the goal. Survival was the goal. Calories were the goal. Avoiding predators was the goal. Not dying from infection because you got one bad cut on your leg was the goal. Ancient humans did not have the luxury, at least in theory, to sit around wondering whether someone liked them back. And yet somehow, somewhere inside that brutal world, love happened anyway. And that is what makes this story so unsettling. Love did not emerge after life became soft enough to allow it. Love seems to have emerged while life was still hard enough to punish it. If you look deep into human evolution, one of the first clues appears in something that sounds dry and technical and completely unromantic: sexual dimorphism, which is just the scientific term for the size difference between males and females. In species where males are dramatically larger, stronger, and more heavily armed than females, you usually get intense male competition, domination, and access to mates controlled by force. Think gorillas. One dominant male, multiple females. A system built less on connection than on conquest. But early hominin evidence suggests something changed on our branch of the family tree. By the time of species like Ardipithecus, researchers point to reduced canine size and reduced sexual dimorphism compared with the kind of extreme male competition you see in some other primates. And that matters, because in evolutionary terms, a drop in male weaponization is not a tiny footnote. It can signal a shift away from pure violent competition and toward more stable pair relationships. Not guaranteed monogamy, not instant soulmates, but a world in which brute force starts losing some of its monopoly and other traits begin to matter more. In other words, one of the earliest chapters in the story of human love may have started when being the biggest, meanest male stopped being the only viable strategy. That is already incredible. But it gets better. Because one of the strongest ideas in human evolutionary theory is that pair bonding may have become more important when some males started doing something radically different from just competing. They started providing food, protection, ongoing investment. Instead of trying only to overpower rivals, some males may have improved their chances by forming more stable bonds and directing resources toward particular females and offspring. From the outside, that sounds clinical. From the inside, it is the ancient blueprint of something we would instantly recognize. I leave, I take risks, I come back, and what I brought back is for you. That might be one of the oldest romantic sentences in human history, even before anybody had words for it. Think about how strange that is. In a dangerous prehistoric landscape, bringing resources to a specific person was not just generous, it was costly, it was selective. It meant choosing not to spread effort everywhere. It meant preference. It meant continuity. It meant that among all the people in the group, one connection was becoming more important than the others. We can dress it up with modern language if we want, but at its core, this is ancient emotional economics. Out of everyone here, I am investing in you. And once that starts happening, the entire social world changes. Because human children are, biologically speaking, absurd. A baby horse is born and within hours it can stand. A baby deer gets a head start on existence almost immediately. Human babies arrive catastrophically unfinished. They are needy for years, not days, not weeks, years. Their brains develop slowly. Their bodies remain dependent for an extraordinarily long time. Raising one child is hard. Raising multiple children without reliable support is punishing. which means that in human evolution, long-term cooperation between adults is not some sweet extra feature tacked onto survival. It is survival. This is why the story of love is not just about attraction. It is about endurance. If you are living in a species where offspring take forever to raise, then the ideal mate is not just the strongest body in the room. The ideal mate is the one who stays, the one who shares, the one who notices, the one who helps when the child is sick, when food is scarce, when winter is bad, when everything goes wrong at once. Reliability becomes biologically meaningful. Loyalty becomes adaptive. Commitment stops being just a moral idea and becomes a practical advantage with emotional consequences, which means something deeply inconvenient for every lazy stereotype about prehistoric mating. Ancient humans were not simply playing a non-stop game of strongest male wins. That picture is too crude, too cinematic, too stupid for what human evolution actually seems to have been doing. Human pair bonding is much messier, much more flexible, and much more interesting than that. Across cultures, anthropologists see enormous variation in marriage systems and norms, but the residential pair bond itself appears again and again as a basic feature of human life. Not perfect, not universal in one rigid form, but persistent, deeply persistent. And once you realize that, the next question becomes almost unbearable. Fine, maybe the structure was there, maybe the cooperation was there, maybe the pair bond was there, but was there anything we would actually call romance? Anything emotional? Anything recognizably human in the way we mean it when we say, I missed you, I chose you, I was afraid to lose you. This is where the story shifts from social strategy into something more intimate. Because by roughly the time Homo sapiens appears, the brain architecture involved in attachment, reward, fear, pleasure, and grief is already in place. The neurochemical systems linked with bonding did not arrive with modern dating culture. Dopamine did not wait for texting. Oxytocin did not wait for wedding vows. The machinery that makes human attachment possible is ancient. The hardware existed long before the apps did. Which means if ancient humans formed bonds, protected partners, grieved absences, and oriented their lives around particular people, then they were not doing so as emotionless robots carrying out a spreadsheet. They were doing it with brains already capable of longing. And then you get to the archaeological hints that make this whole thing stop feeling abstract. Take personal ornamentation. For a very long time, humans started doing something astonishing, decorating themselves. Shell beads, pigment, ochre, objects deliberately altered or selected to be seen by other people. In Morocco, shell beads dating roughly 142,000 to 150,000 years ago have been interpreted as some of the earliest known evidence of symbolic, visible, nonverbal communication. That phrase sounds academic until you translate it into normal human language. It means people were making choices about how they appeared to others. They were signaling identity, meaning, belonging, distinction. And once humans begin doing that, a whole emotional universe opens. Because why do you decorate yourself in a harsh world? Why spend precious time shaping appearance when survival is already expensive? Part of the answer is social signaling. Part of it is group identity. But it is very hard not to notice how naturally this overlaps with attraction. To ornament yourself is to say, look at me, notice me, read me correctly, understand what I'm trying to tell the world before I even speak. That is not modern. That is ancient. The shell may be old, the impulse is current. We still do it. We just upgraded the materials. The bead becomes the necklace. Ochre becomes makeup. Carefully arranged feathers become carefully chosen outfits. A shell chosen for visibility becomes a profile picture chosen with suspiciously prehistoric levels of strategic intent. The tools change. The instinct does not. And here is the part that gets unexpectedly tender. Those early symbolic objects moved. Similar beads show up across distances and networks, which means objects could travel, which means meaning could travel, which means at some point, very likely, we handed another human being an object that mattered, maybe as status, maybe as alliance, maybe as memory, maybe as attraction, but we had ever exact emotion sat behind it. The gesture itself is hauntingly familiar. I found this, I kept it, I brought it to you. That is dangerously close to romance. Now add music, and things become almost impossible not to feel. The oldest preserved flutes we have are around 40,000 to 50,000 years old, made from bone and ivory. But nobody serious thinks that means music suddenly popped into existence at that date, out of nowhere. Perishable instruments vanish. Voices leave no fossil. Hands striking bodies, wood, hide, earth, firelight rhythms, melodies carried in memory instead of stone. All of that could be vastly older. The preserved flute record only tells us when music started surviving in material form, not when it began living in human emotion. And what was music for? Many things, obviously: ritual, coordination, group identity, memory. But Darwin famously suggested that music may also have been tied, at least in part, to sexual selection, to display, to attraction, to the emotional presentation of self, which makes a certain kind of prehistoric scene almost unbearable to imagine. Someone sitting near a fire, shaping sound deliberately, not because it helps kill prey or sharpen tools, but because it reaches another person in a way practical language cannot, because it says something too risky or too large or too vague to say directly, because maybe before humans had polished speech, they still had rhythm. They still had melody. They still had the urge to move someone. If that is true, then somewhere in prehistory, someone essentially got serenaded, not with roses, not with violins, but with whatever fragile, beautiful sound a human body or a carved bone could make in the dark. And if you think that is not romantic, I honestly do not know what your standards are. But love is not only display and attraction. It is also care under pressure. Care when beauty is not the E-point. Care when there is no obvious payoff. That is why the Neanderthal evidence matters so much. At Shanidar, one famous individual, known as Shanidar I, appears to have survived for years despite serious injuries and disabilities that likely would have made independent survival extremely difficult. Researchers argue that this implies direct support and accommodation from others in the social group. Now, we should be careful here. Archaeology cannot climb into a Neanderthal skull and label the motive with total certainty. We cannot say with absolute confidence that what sustained him was love in the poetic modern sense. Maybe some of it was kinship, maybe some of it was reciprocity, maybe some of it was practical value, memory, status, or social obligation. But here is what we can say. Someone stayed involved, someone adjusted, someone kept helping when helping was not easy. And whatever exact word you choose for that, it lives in the same emotional neighborhood as love. This is one of the biggest mistakes people make when they imagine ancient humans. They think romance begins only when life becomes elegant enough for it, when there are poems, when there are private houses, when there are mirrors and letters and wine and long philosophical conversations. But if the evidence points anywhere, it points here. Attachment deepened not after necessity ended, but because necessity was so severe. Love was not the opposite of survival. Love may have been one of the things survival selected for. Not fantasy, not the entire modern romantic industry, but attachment, preference, jealousy, grief, devotion, bond maintenance, the terrifying elevation of one person above the background noise of everybody else. And yes, jealousy belongs in this story too, because it is love's less photogenic shadow. Once humans invest heavily in pair bonds, offspring, and long-term cooperation, threats to that bond become serious. Jealousy is not glamorous, it is not noble by default, but it makes an evolutionary sense. If another person can destabilize the bond around which your emotional and practical world is organized, your brain responds like something important is under attack. Which, from its perspective, it is. The existence of jealousy does not cheapen love. If anything, it proves how consequential the bond had become. You do not guard what means nothing. And still, for all this ancient machinery, human love was probably never simple. It was almost certainly messy. Sometimes faithful, sometimes not. Sometimes mutual, sometimes painfully uneven. Sometimes stabilizing, sometimes violent, sometimes tender, sometimes strategic, often all at once. Ancient humans were not purified by living earlier. They were human, which means their emotional lives were probably complicated in ways we would recognize immediately. That might be the most unsettling part of all, because we like to imagine that our romantic confusion is modern, that our mixed signals, attachment issues, fear of abandonment, longing for certainty, and talent for ruining perfectly good emotional situations are somehow products of technology, modernity, or overstimulation. But the deeper story seems to be that the structure underneath those feelings is old. Very old. The setting changed, the nervous system did not. The person staring into a fire 100,000 years ago, wondering whether someone across that fire felt the same pull, may not be as different from you as you want them to be. They did not have your vocabulary. They did not have your dating apps. They did not have your playlists, therapy language, relationship podcasts, or endless access to other people's opinions. But they had bodies that reacted. They had reward systems. They had fear. They had attachment. They had the ability to choose, to wait, to hope, to compete, to mourn, to invest, to ornament, to notice, to remember. And perhaps most importantly, they had the growing human tendency to make one relationship matter enough to organize life around it. That is the real answer to the question, how did ancient humans fall in love when romance was never the goal? They fell in love the same way humans do almost everything important. Accidentally at first, imperfectly, under pressure, through solutions to other problems that turned into feelings large enough to outgrow their original purpose. Pair bonding may have begun because helpless children required cooperation. Provisioning may have emerged because shared investment improved survival. Ornamentation may have helped communicate identity across growing groups. Music may have amplified display, bonding, memory, and emotion. Care may have strengthened groups in practical ways. But once all of those systems existed together inside a brain capable of attachment, something extraordinary happened. Survival created the conditions, and emotion moved in. Romance was never the original goal, but somewhere along the way, the strategy became a feeling. The mechanism became an ache. The social structure became a person. And that person became special. That is what love may be at its deepest level. Not a luxury added to human life after everything else was solved, but a byproduct so powerful that it stopped being a byproduct. A survival pattern that became a private universe. A practical bond that became meaning. A way of raising children and sharing risk that somehow transformed into poetry, obsession, sacrifice, jealousy, tenderness, memory, devotion, and the unbearable vulnerability of needing one specific person to choose you back. Which means the next time you catch yourself overanalyzing a text, or replaying a conversation, or feeling ridiculous because one person has managed to rearrange your entire inner world just by existing, remember this. You are not experiencing some trivial modern glitch. You are participating in one of the oldest emotional experiments on Earth. Older than cities, older than writing, older than formal religion, older than recorded history, possibly older than fully modern language. Ancient humans may not have called it romance. They may not have written songs about soulmates or whispered dramatic promises under the stars, but they almost certainly knew the beginning of preference, the pain of uncertainty, the magnetic force of attachment, and the strange, terrifying miracle of caring about one person more than survival logic says you should. Somebody, tens of thousands of years ago, decorated themselves hoping to be seen. Somebody brought food back for someone specific. Somebody kept caring for an injured companion long after convenience had disappeared. Somebody made music in the dark and watched another face across the fire. Somebody felt jealous. Somebody felt chosen. Somebody felt abandoned. Somebody felt relief when the other person returned. Somebody felt that unbearable warmth of being wanted by exactly the one person they wanted back. And because those people kept finding each other, losing each other, choosing each other, and building fragile human bonds in a world that did not care whether they succeeded or not, you are here. So no, ancient humans probably did not have modern romance. What they had was the raw material that modern romance is made of. Attachment before poetry, devotion before philosophy, longing before love letters. The body learning the truth before language had elegant words for it. And honestly, when you think about it that way, love becomes even more astonishing than the modern version ever allowed. Because it means that before we built civilizations, before we built laws, before we built literature, before we built the stories we tell about love, love in its oldest form was already quietly building us.